The voice cracked across the Fort Hood morning like a whip snap, contemptuous, carrying, laced with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything in a room he controlled. Staff Sergeant Victor Doyle stood with his hands on his hips at the edge of the firing line, the early October sun catching the polished brass of his dress uniform, his eyes moving over the old man the way a man looks at something he intends to remove. Harold Goss was 81 years old. He stood just inside the range perimeter in a canvas barn coat the color of old rust, worn corduroys with a crease that had surrendered to history, and a pair of lace-up work boots that had been resoled and resoled again until they were more repair than original. His hands hung loose at his sides, liver-spotted, the knuckles like river stones, completely still. He was not looking at Doyle. He was looking at the tank. The M1A2 Abrams sat 200 meters downrange from the firing position, cold and inexplicably silent for the third morning in a row. The tank had passed its last depot inspection without a single flag. It had been certified by two separate maintenance crews, a technical representative from General Dynamics Land Systems and a gunnery sergeant with 22 years on armored vehicles, who had run out of ideas on Wednesday and run out of language to describe his bafflement on Thursday. The problem was not mechanical. Every diagnostic said so. The 120mm main gun simply would not fire. Not a misfire, not a hang fire, a refusal, quiet, complete, as if the system had decided the answer was no and intended to keep deciding that indefinitely. The range smelled of diesel and autumn grass and the particular sharp bite of a Texas morning that had not yet made up its mind about the temperature. A wind came off the open plateau in irregular gusts, dragging dust in small spirals across the hardpack. Harold Goss looked at those spirals. He looked at the tank. He said nothing. "Sir." Specialist Keisha Odom materialized at Doyle's shoulder, her expression carrying the careful neutrality of someone managing a situation she did not create. He was cleared through the main gate. "There's a note from Battalion S3 that I don't need a note from S3. Doyle's voice was not lowered. There were 14 soldiers within easy earshot, and Doyle knew the geometry of a crowd. "What I need is for this gentleman to explain to me what his relationship to a classified training range is. Because I've got General Dynamics out here. I've got two of the best armored systems techs in 3 Corps, and none of them can figure out what's wrong with this gun. But apparently Battalion has sent me." He gestured in Harold's direction with the particular sweep of a man making a gift of his contempt to his audience. "This." Harold Goss turned his head toward Doyle. His eyes were pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and they held a depth that did not reflect the aggression directed at them, but simply absorbed it and continued existing at the same depth they had always been. He looked at Doyle for a moment the way a man looks at weather, acknowledging it, not particularly interested in arguing with it. "The computer is fighting the gun," Harold said. His voice was a low, unhurried rumble, the sound of something that had decided a long time ago that volume was not the same as authority. "The firing control system got a software update last week that reset the default bore sight calibration to factory spec. But this particular gun's barrel has 300 miles on it and a permanent 3-click left drift from a contact in '04 that never got written into the permanent record. The computer is telling it to fire where the barrel was in 2003. The barrel isn't there anymore." He looked back at the tank. "You've got to teach the computer where the gun actually lives." Two of the techs near the vehicle glanced at each other. Doyle held a beat of silence, long enough to be deliberate, short enough to suggest he was entertaining the possibility of humor. Then the laugh came, short, performed, directed at the junior soldiers to his left, like a small gift. "Hear that? 300 miles on the barrel. Computer thinks it's 2003. He stepped closer, and his size made the step communicate something. He was broad and solid and 28 years old, and stood the way men stand when they have spent their entire adult life being right. You want to know what those guys have out there? Those guys have GCA's laptop diagnostics that cost $40,000 apiece. They have direct line access to the development team at General Dynamics. You know what you've got, Grandpa? He reached out and flicked the small metal pin on Harold Goss's barn coat lapel. A worn, dark thing, barely larger than a thumbnail. The kind of thing a man keeps on a coat not to be seen, but because it belongs there. Doyle's fingers struck it with the particular casualness of a man demonstrating that a thing does not matter. You've got a pin on a coat. The diesel smell dropped away. The noise came first, as it always did, the particular layered thunder of 68 tons in motion, the ground transmitting it upward through the soles of boots and the bones of legs, and the base of the spine before the sound itself arrived. He was 22 years old, and he was the gunner in the left seat of an M60A3 Patton somewhere in the Fulda Gap, West Germany, February of 1968. During an exercise that had gone from training to something considerably more serious, when 3 Soviet reconnaissance elements crossed the border at a point they were not supposed to cross. The temperature inside the turret was 4 degrees above what the temperature was outside, which meant it was cold in a way that made concentration feel like a physical act. The tank commander above him, Staff Sergeant Elmore Cates, a lean and ironic man from Beaumont, Texas, who had a habit of narrating armor engagements in the same tone he used to describe baseball games, had his hatch open despite the temperature because Cates trusted his eyes more than his optics at distance, and he had seen something at distance that he wanted his eyes on. "Range to that tree line," Cates said. Not a question. Harold was already in his sight picture. 1,100 meters. Wind right to left, gusting about 8 miles an hour on the gust, 5 on the base. He paused. "But the guns got adrift from that hit we took on the eastern berm last week. I didn't report it because we were moving, and I figured maintenance would catch it at inspection. Did they catch it?" "No. Then what do you need to do?" Harold already had his hands on the elevation and traverse controls, making the minute corrections that the computer, which knew nothing about the contact on the eastern berm and nothing about the gun's accumulated history of use and damage, could not make. He was doing what a gunner does when he knows his gun better than his equipment does. He was thinking past the system to the machine itself, understanding the gap between where the computer said the round would go and where the gun would actually send it, and splitting that difference with his hands. "I know where she lives," Harold said. "She's 3 clicks left and a touch low. I've got her." Cates was quiet for a moment. The cold pressed in. Somewhere in the tree line, something moved and then was still. "Then, take the shot," Cates said. "Don't let the computer think for you." The engagement lasted 11 seconds. When it was over, Cates dropped back into the hatch and pulled it shut and looked at Harold the way a man looks at something he has been watching become what it was supposed to be. He reached into his chest pocket and produced a small pin, dark metal, the insignia of an armor unit designation that Harold didn't yet belong to, worn smooth from years of handling. Cates turned it over once. "My brother's," Cates said. He did not say anything more about that. He set the pin on the fire control panel between them with a deliberateness that made it mean something, and then he turned his attention back to the optics, because in that line of work there was always something else that needed attention. He was killed by a landmine during a separate incident 17 days later on a road outside Kassel. He was 31 years old. Harold Goss blinked, and the Texas morning came back around him. The wind, the dust spirals, the smell of diesel and dry grass. Doyle's finger was still on his lapel pin. Specialist Keisha Odom was 23 years old and had been assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division's Maintenance Support Company for 8 months. And she had spent 6 of those months learning the exact texture of the space between what Staff Sergeant Doyle said and what was actually true. She was good at her job, and she was quiet about being good at her job, and she had the particular patience of a person who understands that the ground always tells you what it knows. Eventually, if you're willing to stand on it long enough. She had watched the old man walk through the range gate, and she had watched Doyle move through his stages. The opening dismissal, the audience performance, the escalation towards something physical. And she had watched Harold Goss through all of it with the quality of attention she gave to systems that were not behaving the way their operators expected. The old man had not flinched, had offered one sentence of diagnosis that had made 2 of the General Dynamics techs go very quiet, and he was wearing a pin that Keisha Odom did not recognize, but that had made the rangemaster, a hard and weathered sergeant first class named Briggs, who had been doing this for 19 years, look away from the confrontation in the specific manner of a man who has recognized something and is deciding what to do about it. Briggs caught Odom's eye. He nodded once in the direction of the equipment office at the far end of the range. Odom went. Briggs followed 30 seconds later, leaving a junior specialist to manage the perimeter. Inside the equipment office, which smelled of gun oil and stale coffee and the particular institutional mustiness of a building that had been important for a long time, Briggs picked up the landline receiver and held it for a moment before dialing. "You know who that is?" Odom said. "I think so," Briggs said. "Been a long time." He dialed. "If I'm right, what I'm about to do is either the smartest thing I've done this year or the dumbest." The line rang twice. A duty sergeant answered. Briggs said his own name and rank and then said the name Harold Goss. The silence that hit the line was total and immediate, the kind that is not a pause but a reckoning. It stretched for 5 full seconds. When the duty sergeant's voice returned, it had been stripped of every layer of professional routine, and what was underneath was something taut and entirely different. "Say that name again, Sergeant." Briggs said it again. "Harold Goss is on your range. Right now, today, standing about 40 meters from me." "Yes, sir." There was a sound on the line, a chair, a hand on a desk, the particular acoustic quality of a man who has just stood up very quickly. "Do not let anyone put a hand on that man. Do you understand me? No one touches him, nothing escalates, the situation stays exactly where it is. I am making a call right now." Then, muffled but audible, a second conversation beginning. A voice that Briggs recognized by its cadence as a field-grade officer saying a name to another field-grade officer, and the response being the sound of someone who had been sitting down no longer sitting down, and the words, "Get me Colonel Vannick's vehicle." Now, Briggs set the receiver down. He looked at Odom. "Go back out there," he said. "Stay close to him." She went. On the firing line, Doyle had reached his conclusion. He had Harold Goss's barn coat lapel between 2 fingers, not quite a grip, but not anything else either. And his voice had descended to the register he used at the end of patience, which was its own kind of escalation. Around them, 14 soldiers were performing the very specific kind of not watching that is in fact the most attentive watching possible. "Here's what happens now," Doyle said. "You go back out the gate you came in. The people who actually belong here go back to solving the actual problem. And this little situation is done." He made a small motion with the fingers holding the lapel. Not quite a push. Not quite a dismissal, but something in that direction. "We clear?" Harold Goss looked at him. The pale blue eyes, the depth that did not reflect the anger directed at it but held its own dimension entirely. the way a very old river holds its depth beneath whatever surface weather is happening above. "Clear the boresight memory from the firing control computer," Harold said. His voice had not changed by a single degree. "Reset the system to a manual calibration baseline, then input the actual drift values for this specific gun. Not factory spec, not the maintenance record, the actual values. Use the target at marker 11. The wind is right to left, base 4 miles an hour with a 7-mile gust on a 6-second cycle. Compensate left, 3 clicks. Fire from a standing start. Don't let the computer pre-calculate. She'll hit inside the ring on the first shot." Behind Doyle, one of the General Dynamics techs had taken out a notebook. The sound reached the range before the vehicles did. A deep, organized rumble felt through the ground, through the hardpack, through the soles of boots and the teeth, building from the West Road with the particular urgency of vehicles that have not stopped for anything between their origin and this point. 3 Army vehicles rounded the corner of the range access road, 2 green Humvees, and a staff car between them, moving in a tight formation that deposited itself at the range entrance with doors opening before engines fully stopped. 8 soldiers emerged, dress greens. They positioned themselves with a wordless economy of people who have rehearsed this exact kind of moment without ever having rehearsed it explicitly. The last door of the staff car opened. Colonel Diane Vanek stepped onto the hardpack. Colonel Vanek was 52 years old and wore the particular expression of a person who left an important meeting at speed and has not yet discharged the energy that departure required. She was not large, but she moved with the absolute assurance of a woman who had stopped caring what a room thought of her entrance approximately 20 years ago. She came through the range gate, and her eyes crossed the scene once, rapidly, and then they found Harold Goss, and they stopped moving. She walked straight toward him. She did not acknowledge Doyle. She did not look at the tank. She did not address the line of watching soldiers or the General Dynamics techs or the range equipment that represented several $1 million of diagnostic capability. The path from the gate to Harold Goss was a straight line, and she traveled it with the focused, unhurried pace of someone who has been wanting to cross a particular distance for some time. She saw Doyle's fingers on Harold Goss's lapel. Something moved in her jaw. Doyle's fingers came off the coat. Colonel Diane Vanek, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division's 3rd Brigade Combat Team, came to attention 3 feet in front of Harold Goss and rendered the sharpest, most breathtakingly precise salute that Staff Sergeant Victor Doyle had witnessed in 9 years of military service. It was not a greeting. It was not a courtesy. It was a salute with the whole weight of what it meant behind it. Chin level, hand edge perfect, eyes fixed forward, everything in it exact. She held it directed at the old man in the rust-colored barn coat. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. The silence that moved through the assembled soldiers was not made of sound. It was made of the sudden collective understanding that the ground had shifted under all of them. Harold Goss raised his right hand, map-worked, spotted, the hand of a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything and returned the salute with a precision that had no business existing in a hand that age. Then he lowered it. Then she lowered hers. Doyle's face had the quality of a man who has just discovered that the floor he was standing on was not a floor. Colonel Vanek reached into her jacket. She produced a folded document and turned to face the assembled range personnel, the soldiers, the techs, the crew chiefs, everyone who had been part of the audience for the morning. "I'm going to read something," she said. Her voice carried without being raised, the way the voices of people who have never needed to shout always carry. "And I want everyone here to listen carefully." She unfolded the paper. Harold James Goss, Master Sergeant, United States Army, retired, service period, 1964 to 1991. 27 years. She let that number stand in the air. First assigned to the 1st Armored Division, Germany, 1965. Certified M60A3 gunner, the fastest certification time recorded in that division in a decade. She looked up once, then returned. Combat deployment, Vietnam 1968 to 1969. Gunner and tank commander, 1st Battalion, 77th Armor. 12 confirmed engagements during the Tet Offensive, cited in the battalion after-action report for demonstrating, and I am quoting, a level of organic gunnery skill that exceeded what fire control technology could replicate. A soldier who routinely outshot his own equipment. She turned a page. After Vietnam, assigned as Master Gunnery Instructor, Armor School, Fort Knox, 1970 to 1978. He developed a manual bore sight calibration protocol for battle-worn guns that is still taught in the Armor Basic course today. She held the pause. Brought out of retirement in 1983 to consult on the M1 Abrams fire control integration. His input on the gap between software-calibrated fire control and field-worn gun drift was incorporated into the M1A2 upgrade package. She looked up. The exact gap this vehicle is experiencing right now. No one on the range made a sound. Awards: Army Commendation Medal with Valor. Bronze Star, twice, both with Valor. Silver Star. Purple Heart, 3 times. The Army Distinguished Service Medal for contributions to armor doctrine spanning 3 decades. She refolded the document. The enemy had a name for him. North Vietnamese forces in his operational area called him Bông Ma Thep, the Steel Ghost, because his rounds arrived before his position could be found. Because he understood his gun in a way that made him impossible to predict or account for. She looked at Doyle. The pin on his lapel is the insignia of the M1 Abrams Development Advisory Group, 1983. He helped decide what this tank would be able to do. The silence was deathly. The gun you cannot fire, Colonel Vanek said, was partly designed by the man you just put your hands on. The formal proceedings against Doyle began that afternoon and concluded within 2 weeks. What emerged was proportionate and not without mercy. He was young, and the institutional view of young arrogance in a person with genuine ability is generally that it can be corrected if the correction is applied correctly. He was assigned to a mandatory professional development program and a temporary reassignment to an administrative role that gave him 6 weeks of proximity to institutional history without the stage of a firing range to perform on. The quieter consequences were their own education. After Colonel Vanek had folded her document, and the formal matters were addressed, Harold Goss walked to the General Dynamics tech, who had taken out a notebook and said 4 sentences. Specific, quiet, complete. And the tech wrote them down and did not look up immediately, because he was still processing. Then, Harold walked to the tank. He spent 11 minutes at the fire control access panel, working with the deliberate economy of a man who has made this exact set of movements so many times they live below conscious thought. When he stepped back and nodded to the crew chief, the startup ran. Then the calibration sequence. Then Harold said, "Fire when ready." The 120mm main gun of the M1A2 Abrams spoke once, cleanly, and the target at marker 11 ceased to exist. The sound rolled out across the Texas plateau and came back off the distant tree line and was gone. Doyle was standing near the range edge. Harold walked to him and placed a gentle hand on the same shoulder Doyle had gripped minutes before. The inversion was not lost on a single soldier watching. Doyle looked at that hand with the expression of a man who does not yet have the vocabulary for what he is feeling. "The gear is good," Harold said, and there was nothing in his voice that was triumphant or unkind. "The computers are good. I've watched them get better my whole career." He removed his hand, but the computer knows the gun it was designed for. It doesn't know your gun, the one with 300 miles and a contact in '04 in it. That part is your job. He glanced at the Abrams one final time. Learn your machine, not just the manual. The machine. They're not always the same thing. He walked to the waiting car and was gone. It was a Sunday morning in November, at a feed and hardware store on the edge of Killeen, the kind of place with wooden floors and a smell of seed and machine oil, and the specific warm metal scent of a store that has been useful for a very long time. Doyle was in the fasteners aisle, in civilian clothes, holding 2 different grades of bolt with the expression of a man doing the kind of quiet practical work that follows a period of sustained humbling. He registered the barcode before he registered the face, and for a moment he stood very still. Harold Goss was examining a display of work gloves near the far end of the aisle, holding one up to the light with the focused attention of a man for whom the correct glove is not a small matter. Doyle came down the aisle. He stopped 5 feet away and held the stop for a moment, then closed the remaining distance. "Mr. Goss," he looked at the man. "I've been wanting to say something. What I said and did on that range, the way I talked to you, the way I handled it, that was wrong. It wasn't about you. It was about me and an audience, and about being sure I was right when I hadn't done the first thing necessary to know whether I was right." He stopped. "I'm sorry." Harold Goss looked at him with the pale blue eyes, and whatever was in them was not warm exactly, but it was not cold either. It was the expression of a man who has accepted many things in his life and understands that acceptance is its own form of respect. "I know you are," Harold said. He looked back at the gloves, selected one, and then looked at Doyle again. "You good with your hands?" Doyle blinked. "Sir?" "Around the house. You handy?" "Aye, some. I'm fixing up a truck." "Then you want the leather palm, not the synthetic." Harold set the pair he'd selected back and pulled a different one from the rack and held it out. "Synthetic'll tear on the underside of a frame. Leather breathes and holds up." He turned back to the display with the air of a man who has said what he had to say and returned to the project at hand. Doyle stood holding the gloves for a moment. Then he put them in his basket. He watched Harold Goss move slowly down the aisle toward the register. The old rust-colored barn coat, the worn work boots, the small dark pin on the lapel catching the November light for a moment before he turned the corner and was gone. The men and women who built this country's ability to fight and survive do not announce themselves. They carry their history in objects small enough to overlook and in knowledge deep enough to seem like instinct. And they walk among us in hardware stores and feed stores and diners. And if we are quiet enough and humble enough and paying the right kind of attention, they will hand us exactly what we need. If you were moved by Harold's story of quiet courage and timeless wisdom, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes. And click that notification bell so you never miss a story of the quiet warriors who walk among us.